All right. Good evening, everyone. So, after the theories of perception, now we will go through the theories of cognition and motor action. Again, it will be at the very introductory level, and we will look at some aspect of cognitive psychology and physiology. And our main focus will be on the relevance of cognition and motor action for UI/UX design purpose. So, in terms of cognition, of course, brain is the central nervous system which takes care of all cognition, and brain can be divided into different functional region which can be found by fMRI or functional magnetic resonance imaging, or also can be uh, inferred while doctors treated patients with brain lesion at defined parts of brain. And as you can see that we talked about the visual cortex and visual association area in morning, which takes care of vision. And the primary motor cortex is marked in green somewhere in middle, and the premotor area. But at this point, I should also mention that uh, the brain doesn't work in an isolated way. Rather, the whole brain is somehow engaged in every aspect of our cognition, perception, or motor action. But these activity of neurons, they have been clustered for specific function at specific region, which gives birth to this type of functional division of the brain. So one important aspect of any interface design task is that how much information the user has to remember, or as we are talking in morning about recognition rather than recall. So in this context, it will be important to know that the structure of memory. So this is more like a conceptual structure, but the physiology closely follow this conceptual division. So we have listed six of our primary senses here. The top one is proprioception, or a sense of your own body parts. Then the olfactory, or the sense of uh, smell. Then eye or vision, auditory perception, and perception of gustatory perception, or the sense of taste. And finally, this tactile, haptic, or tactile feedback, which we get through our skin all over the body. So all of these senses associated with a sensory memory, which has a very small retention period of 0.25 seconds, and the information from the sensory memory is being transferred to our short-term memory, which you can roughly relate to the rapid access memory in a standard computer terminology. So it has low capacity, but the reheard and it has low capacity, but we can retrieve information very quickly from the short-term memory, just like our rapid access memory in a computer. And then the rest part is the long-term memory, where information can be stored for the whole lifetime. And the whole short-term memory and the subset of the long-term memory is modeled as our working memory, where we can store information from 1 second to 20 minutes. And of course, the retention period of information increases with rehearsal. Some early influential work in understanding cognition is the famous work or the paper by uh, Makula and Pitts on solving digital logic problems using neurons, which later gives rise to this whole field of neural network, or more generically, the connectionist approach of artificial intelligence. And the Fitts law, which tried to model the rapid aiming movement, which we will look across in later slides in further detail. But the biggest problem is that all these segmented works presented a partial picture, like how perception works, how auditory perception works, or how problem solving skill works, not like a holistic picture. So this is the picture of Alan Newell, and he is considered one of the father figures of modern AI. So in 1972 Carnegie Symposium, he presented a seminal paper whose title was "You Can't Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win." And in that lecture and then onwards, he advocated for a single theory or unified theory of cognition. And he himself reckoned that there may not be a single theory which explains everything of our cognitive principles. So the book that he published, its name was also on Unified Theories of Cognition. And he divided all of our action based on the timing. Say, for example, the biological band, which works at the neural circuit level. So in morning, when I was talking about this retinal ganglion cell and the primary visual cortex, so these are all happenings at the biological band, which occurs at 10 to the power minus 4 to 10 to the power minus 2 seconds. And then comes the cognitive band, which looks at activity at unit task level, like for pressing a particular key or typing a particular letter or tapping on your smartphone on a particular icon, which takes from 1/10 of a second to the 10th of a second. And on top, there are rational band and social band, which looks at a larger scale of action. And as you may already note that these actions, they kind of accumulate. So a set of synaptic reactions that give rise to a unit task, and a set of unit tasks define our social or rational task. Say, for example, there is something happening on my brain, and due to that, I am typing a set of, I am pressing a set of key on my keyboard, and a sequence of pressing of these keys actually uh, present a set of lecture slides to you. So the presentation of lecture slide is a rational activity, and you are going through the lecture notes, and you are perhaps learning something, and then you are writing exam, and you are passing course, and then you are going to a job. So that constitute we are moving to the social band. So like that, we using the time scale of action, Alan Newell try to classify all human activity. And in this context, he proposed a model, the SOAR model, or this is formally known as cognitive architecture. So it has a very ambitious aim to model all human activity. So the SOAR came from earlier work of Alan Newell on making a general problem solver or GPS system. This GPS is not like the global positioning system GPS, rather the full form is general problem solver. So it was an automated problem solver of first order logic, like this AND OR logic. And he tried to model all human cognitive activity through a symbolic system. What do you mean by symbolic system? That all information has been uh, symbolized by letters like A, B, etc. And he proposed a state space model. So maybe in later on the course, we will look at more detail on state space model, which is generally taught at a introductory level of AI lectures. But at this point, we can think it in this way, that all our information storage has been modeled as a first order logic statement, and all our inference has been modeled in the form of execution of if and then loops, that we store information in the form of A, B, like propositional statement, and procedural memory stores a set of rules like if A then B, and we execute this role on the set of procedural statements, and that's how we infer. And it also successfully model a set type of learning, if not all types of learning, through the chunking mechanism. That means if we do not find a rule, then we combine existing rules and create new rules. So all these can be automated and presented in a machine readable form. And so far I remember, the whole system was written in a programming language called the Lisp, and it is freely downloadable. So using that, you can model many cognitive activity using just pure symbol processing. And why we spend so much time on this particular model? Because we may consider, although there were earlier very significant work on Sketchpad by Ivan Sutherland, or the invention of mouse, but the field of human computer interaction, it came into existence in mid 80s with the availability of Apple personal computers, and also that time new easy to use graphical user interfaces were also available from Microsoft, Apple, and other vendors. And Alan Newell, along with his colleague Stuart Card and Thomas Moran, published a book called The Psychology of Human Computer Interaction. And the whole SOAR model, it has been reduced into this concept of model human processor, or sometimes just by acronym MHP, where you can see that the procedural part and the storage part as long-term memory, visual uh, image store, and auditory image store, everything has been modeled as a procedural statement. And it explains like this, that this is our working memory where we store a set of rules and propositions. And when we interact with in machine, we first execute the perceptual processor, which perceive. Then the information is passed to the cognitive module, and it infer what to do based on the perceptual processor, and it instruct the motor processor to do something, and the motor processor execute the action, and the visual stimuli change, and we again perceive. So this perception, cognition, motor action, this cycle turns around, and using that, we can model any human computer interaction task. And in the next lecture, we will look at the Gomes model, which will see that it's maybe too simplistic for the psychologist or physiologist, but it's still now the most commonly used user model or a predictive model, because using this simple loop, we can estimate that how long someone, or more specifically an expert user, will take to execute certain HCI tasks. However, later on, it turns out to be that there are several activities that the humans can perform much faster than the time required to do pure symbolic reasoning. And one such activity is pattern recognition, and a specific example of pattern recognition is face recognition. And you may remember from morning's lecture that there was a bottom-up theory, that when I was showing you the Shanghai picture, that when there is a big white light at the middle of the picture, it's readily attract your attention. So this bottom-up theory, or this automatic processing without symbol, that is not explained by the SOAR model. And this bottom-up processing of information gave rise to another bunch of AI systems, which is known as the connectionist approach. And this connectionist approach, they assume that we store information in the form of a semantic network. So you may come across these terms: ontology, semantic network, and so on. So here is one, that where we relate different concepts based on their meaning, like fish and birds, they are type of animal, fish has gills and fish can swim. So instead of pure propositional statement, as in the SOAR model, we relate concepts based on their meaning. And the actor uses both declarative and procedural memory, just like the SOAR model. But it also supports this connectionist approach, or retrieval of information using data amit as sub-symbolic level. So for this course, you need not to go into the detail of the actor model, but it's important to understand the difference between the symbolic and connectionist approaches, which are already been used to model cognitive activity. And the actor model also tries to predict that how quickly you can do something. But in practice, so what it turns out to be, that to use an actor model efficiently, it requires a lot of parameter tuning, which limits its purpose to use as a generic purpose user model or a predictive model in the practical use for UI UX design. But saying so, still many research groups use the actor type of model to explain certain human cognitive activity. So we can explain this memory retrieval process using this simple animation. So here you imagine that all these red, blue, green blobs, they are a specific concept, and the white lines, they are the relationship among the specific objects. So here, what is our task? That I have seen a evidence, which is this pink or purple colored blob. So for example, in an exam situation, you got a question, and then you have to retrieve relevant information. So here I am marking it as goal. It's again a AI terminology, that in AI we try to reach the goal node. So here the blue colored circle is my goal node. That is maybe the correct answer to the evidence or the question. So how the memory retrieval process works? That first we match the evidence with the surface level concept, and then we activate all the related concepts which are linked to the surface level evidence, and then we continue this process until we reach the goal node. So what you can infer from that, without going into all details of graph theory, that a node with more connections will be retrieved quicker and with higher probability of retrieval. That means if we can store information and link it with various related information, then it has a higher chance to be retrieved. And at this context, again, I can remind you that principle, that recognition rather than recall. That means that if I can recognize the My Documents icon as a document folder, then it will be easier for me to understand that this icon is linking to a storage space where my documents are stored. And finally, of course, we make error. So there is a very good book by the author's name is James Reason, and this book is about his research on error. So errors can be classified into three broad classes: the skill-based performance, the rule-based performance, and the knowledge-based performance error. So the skill-based performance error is like that you have a particular skill, but you did a mistake on that. Say for example, and then there are subdivision among these skill-based performance. That, for example, someone is say playing cricket and he is a very good player, but still he got out for a minor mistake or minor misjudgment. So that is kind of like a skill-based error. On the other hand, say someone doesn't know rule or wrongly apply a rule. Say for example that say there is a ball which the batsman think that it will make a inward movement, so he played for the inward movement, but the ball actually went straighter or make a outward movement. So the batsman applied the wrong rule on playing a particular ball. So that is the rule-based performance. And finally, there is the knowledge-based performance. That say for example, we someone is a first-time player, or someone is trying something for the first time, when he or she doesn't acquire all the rules. So one kind of funny example is that a baseball player trying to play cricket or vice versa, and both of the games involve hitting a ball with a piece of wood, but the knowledge is different. And then as the person commits mistake, so that is at the knowledge based level mistake. And on the right hand side, you can see the flow chart, that how these three types of mistakes, skill, rule, and knowledge based mistakes, that are connected to each other when we undertake any task. So the designer's points are that more connections is easy retrieval. So we should make interface element familiar to user and with analogy to users known objects. And we can identify and categorize prospective errors by end user. So error can be measured at various levels, that I am wrongly icon, or I am trying to click an icon, but I cannot reach the mouse pointer at this level, or on the much higher level, that altogether the person is selecting the wrong icon to certain activity. And you can remember that when you are learning a new cat package, that how step by step you have learned use that. So can consciously make this error classification and reduce the number of knowledge based or rule based errors, so that the user can learn the interface by memorizing less number of rules. And also we should think about short term or working load, memory load, while designing an interface. So for example, if we put too much information on a single screen, so we may assume that the user did not to browse through multiple screens to do all of his activity, but then it will also create a higher working memory load as well as the higher visual search time. On the other hand, if we give too small number of elements on the screen and there is too much white space, that is also bad because then the user has to browse to multiple pages to undertake his required task. So optimal balance in the with keeping the short-term memory and visual search time in mind will help you to make a good interface. And again, here there is no thumb rule that this is the optimum number of icons or this should be the best screen arrangement. So there comes the questions of individual choice, aesthetics, and so on. But even the basic principles still remain same. And in general, perhaps you have already know it that too much cluttering is bad. But still, you may still see that there are many hardware or software interface available where there is this information overload, and we should avoid that. So with that, we will move to the second part of today's talk, which will be on motor action. And in motor action, today we will talk about this particular type of motor action, which is termed as the rapid aiming movements. And it is something like a innate skill. That means even a newborn baby, if you touch at the middle of its palm, you can see that it will clinging its grasp and it trying to reach something. So in later life, it extends to all movement like catching a frisbee disc or typing on the keyboard. And the properties of rapid aiming movement is it is quick, accurate, and pre-programmed. So the next slide we will explain what we mean by pre-program. So a very famous and pioneering study was done on rapid aiming movement by Woodward, and he undertook this study as part of his doctoral research at Columbia University at the year of 1899. That means last to last century. So he was very much impressed by the speed and accuracy with which construction workers hammered nails. And he just wondered that how easily or how quickly, how they can actually do it. So he constructed a study in which involves that people move a stylus back and forth through a slit, reversing the direction of the movements at two visually marked locations. And Woodward recorded participants by allowing a pencil to draw a line on a paper roll. And why like that? Because in 1899 there were no digital circuit or computers available. So he used literally old school methods to record the trajectory. And there were two conditions in the trial. One is while the person is moving the stylus between these two visual markers through the slits with their eyes open. And in another condition, they have to close their eyes. And what he noted that when the eyes are open, the amount of error is proportional to the speed of movement. But when their eyes were closed, the accuracy does not depend on the movement. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, that accuracy doesn't depend on speed. And he measured the mean absolute error with respect to the visual marker to measure the error. From that, he inferred that there are two types of rapid aiming movement. One is termed as initial impulse or pre-programmed, which doesn't require the eye to be involved, and people can do without looking at it. And we can also term it as a ballistic move. Say, for example, um, when a projectile coming towards you at very fast, so we can kind of use some sort of prediction that where the projectile may hit, and based on that we can make a rapid aiming movement towards hitting the projectile. On the other hand, when our eyes are open or we have more time given to hit the projectile, that means the projectile is coming at a much slower speed, then we use the eyes to correct our movement. And the second phase, Woodward named is as current control. Now, remember this study was conducted in 1899. So these are the two phases of movement, the initial impulse and current control. So these names were used by Woodward. So then, after 55 years, in 1954, Paul Fitts, he recreated the Woodward study and this snapshot from his paper, and he went on to predict the rapid aiming movement time. So Woodward only predicted existence of two types of movement, but Fitts went one step forward and he predicted the time of rapid aiming movement as a function of distance to the target. So here distance means the distance between these two visual marker or the stripe sheet and the width of the target, which is 6 inch, as you can see, that is this width. Okay. So using a function of distance and width, he can predict the time of rapid aiming movement. And over time, it has been found that this formula more or less holds true for moving cursor in a screen using mouse or joystick, transferring pegs into hole, aiming movement underwater, and even manipulating objects under a microscope. So then many researchers over time, from 1954 onwards, they tried to explain that why Fitts law worked. And one of the early definition was, or early explanation was given by the iterative correction model by Crossman and Goody. And they told that, imagine that these are our source and destination, and the movement works in this way that from following Woodward study, that there is an initial impulse, and then there comes the visual feedback, and then there is a smaller movement, and then again there is a visual correction, and then is a further smaller movement. And then if we plot this movement time and duration, and it turns out to be a geometric progression, and the logarithmic formula comes as an estimate of time following this multiple movements. However, uh, these problems in this explanation was that the explanation depends on corrective movements. And if we think about the original inspiration of Woodward, that construction workers are hammering nails, so it is very unlikely that when someone is hitting a nail, especially a expert worksman, that he is using any corrective movements. Or you think about the very expert typist who can type something without looking at the keyboard, just by looking at that where they are typing. So we cannot accommodate corrective movements for such type of rapid aiming movements. And that's where the Crossman and Goody's original explanation fails. And also later on they published the initial paper in 1960s. By 1970s, we have more accurate measurement instruments available. And it turns out to be that minimal visual feedback requires around 250 milliseconds. But many expert users can undertake rapid aiming movement at less time than is required for a visual feedback. So then there was another explanation in 1979, which is called the impulse variability model by Smith and his colleagues. And it tells that the rapid aiming movement is a result of a neuromotor impulse, and the distance of movement is proportional to the amounts of force exerted. That means if I have to move the further, we have to put more amount of force, and that also proportional to the variability of the force. So they mainly try to explain that why error is proportional to the speed of movement in the original Woodward study, and they explained it in terms of variability of the force. And as we also told in morning, that in science, if there are more than one theory, of course there will be someone who will try to combine this theory. So that exactly happened here. So David Mayer and his colleagues, they finally developed a model which is still now widely accepted as an explanation of Fitts law, and we will not go into the detailed maths. And they make a mathematical representation by which they can accommodate both Schmidt and Crossman's model, that in several occasions only the initial impulse is good enough to reach target, and in that case the variability in error is proportional to speed. But when users are given more time for visual feedback, then they switch to Crossman and Good's model, and there exists a multiple shorter sub movement, which gives rise to this logarithmic model. And also they changed the base of the logarithm of the original Fitts law. In the original Fitts law, the base was 2, and they used the base as n, so that Fitts law come as a special case. Why do we spend so much time on Fitts law? So this is a snapshot from the Franklin Laurent database, and I am just reading it out. That this is about Stuart Card, who is the one of the co-author of the book of the psychology of human-computer interaction, and it reads like that: that Card's first home run is in the context of baseball, which is equivalent to a six in cricket. So Card's first home run came when he used a then little known law called Fitts law to examine input devices such as joysticks, a head mounted detector, and a new tangled controller that hung by a cable from the computer called a mouse. Fitts law analyzes how easily a human can hit any given target, in this case, moving a cursor to a specific point on a screen. And Card measured the mouse to be almost as simple as if one could move the cursor around on the screen with one's hand. After Card's work, Xerox began manufacturing mice. Apple soon followed, and now they are practically delivered on all computers. So that's how that although mouse was invented earlier, but this is how mouse get popularized as a computer input device. And presently there exists a ISO 9241 standard, which has a lot of other standard also, but it describes a test for evaluating any pointing device. So this is one snapshot from one of our research from in our lab, where we undertake this ISO 9241 task for a head-mounted display system evaluation in the context of flight simulation. So as you can see, there are multiple boxes on the periphery, and one of the boxes turned red. So in the actual study, this shape of the target was round in shape, and the result is a two-dimensional plot. On the x-axis, we plot the index of difficulty. So index of difficulty is equal to log 1 plus d by w, or a function, logarithmic function of the distance to target and width. And here the distance is from the center to the middle of the target, and width is the effective width of the target. So here we can, since these are very small, the actual width should be the diagonal of the square, or we can take the side length also as a width of target. And for a circular target, it will the diameter of the circle. And we plot this movement time with respect to ID for different pointing devices or different conditions. And then we choose the one which has the lowest movement time. And uh, this is a web link. So last summer, our researchers, they make a web equivalent of this ISO 9241 pointing task. So this will always remain free. So you can go to my lab website and the facilities page in the lab website and scroll down. And this is the snapshot of the facilities page. And this is a screenshot of the homepage of the pointing task. So here you can construct your own pointing task by specifying the combinations of distance to target and number of widths. So generally we take a finite number of distances to target and the finite number of widths of target, say 3 and 3. So they are total, there are 9 combinations. We ask participants to undertake pointing tasks for all these 9 conditions multiple times. And also we collect data from multiple participants. And then based on our requirement, we take the average movement time for each individual 9 conditions, and we make this uh, movement time versus ID plot, as I was showing in the previous picture. And that's how we are getting these dots instead of continuous line, because we have a specific or finite number of combinations of target distance and target width. And in our software, you will not only get the movement time versus ID plot, but also you will get some type of radial graph for a set of different parameters which are analyzed based on the cursor or movement trajectory, and that can further help the analysis of pointing devices, whether it is a head mounted head up or a standard display. So you can use that, and it's a complete web-based system. So it's you do not need any software installation, or it's platform independent. So now let us move to at the issues with motor impaired users and what happened in their case. Does Fitts law work? So there was ambiguity among researchers that how Fitts law applicable. So some researchers reported that they found Fitts law to work for even the motor impaired user. And here, please note that motor impaired is a very generic term. There are different types of motor impairment. Broadly, we can divide them as hypokinetic and hyperkinetic. Kinetic means that some has spasm and some has tremor in different body part. And there are also many different causes of motor impairment. And some researchers reported that no, Fitts law doesn't work for them. And some researchers kind of reported that it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So during my doctoral research, I took an innovative step that I worked with the occupational theory therapy department of Addenbrooke's Hospital, and I bought a particular kit which is called hand strength evaluation kit, which consists of the various instruments like dynamometer to measure the grip strength, goniometer measure the range of motion, active range of motion of wrist, and the inclinometer here, which measures the range of motion of forearm. And using that, I undertook ISO pointing task at Papua Trust, which was a rehabilitation center for people with motor impairment. And I found that uh, the overall principle of initial impulse and current control still works for people with motor impairment, but they are each of their movement is divided into multiple sub movements, unlike their able-bodied counterparts who can make a big movement for target. I also noted that they find it difficult to home on target. So initially they have some random movement to get control of the pointing cursor. Then they make a bigger movement towards the target, which sometimes broken into a few sub movements. And how we divide the sub movement is presence of no movement for more than 100 milliseconds. And then they have rapid or some uncontrolled movements towards stopping the pointer movements to home on the target. And using that, I developed some linear regression model which relate the Fitts law parameters like index of performance with hand strength metrics, because the hand strength, I noted that it was an uniform measure to measure the degree of impairment for different kinds of uh, motor disease or motor impairment. And also the model worked for 4 different input devices in touch box, of course, mouse and stylus. So, of course, if any of you are interested, I can send links of those. Now have nearly more than 50 citations. And finally, what are the designer points? That it takes more time to point if the target is away from source and it is small in size. So please keep in mind when you are designing any visual design that, and that's why the measurement of the target in terms of visual angle is so important, because which we discussed in the morning lecture, which also takes care of distance from the screen. And often movement occurs in multiple sub movements, and inter-element spacing to creates a big issue for any user interface design when it will be used by people with motor impairment or by able-bodied users, but under situational impairment. For example, when you are trying to send a SMS while walking, just check that how many times you can wrongly click because that closely spaced, or when you are using a user interface in a moving vehicle, but the whole vehicle is vibrating. So in those cases, some of the lessons that we learn from people with motor impairment becomes equally valid for designing an interface for able-bodied users under situational impairment. So the final takeaway points from this lecture is models of memory and cognition and the introduction to the symbolic and connectionist approach of artificial intelligence in terms of cognitive modeling. And we briefly talked about SOAR and actor model. In the next lecture, we will go into further detail on SOAR and actor from a user modeling or predictive or explanation point of view. We looked at Fitts law analysis and the ISO 94.1 pointing task, and we also looked at the movement patterns of motor impaired users, which will also be relevant for able-bodied users under situational impairment. So with that, I will stop talking.